Hi there, Michael here. Some of the most frequently asked questions on this channel are about mixing in Dolby Atmos. How do you place vocals? What should you do with the drums? How can you make the bass more punchy? Questions like this come up all the time. I've so far intentionally avoided answering these questions since I consider myself more of a technology educator than an audio engineer. I believe it's crucial to not give advice outside of your area of expertise, especially nowadays when everyone seems to think they are an expert on everything. I'm an expert on how to do things and not necessarily why you want to do them, but since I get these mixing questions so often, I felt I could take a different approach to scratch that itch. Instead of giving advice myself, I searched the entirety of the internet to find what I consider the best professional advice and put them into a top 10 list. And this is exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to explore 10 of the most valuable mixing tips from professional Dolby Atmos mixing engineers, curated and commented by yours truly. This is going to be a fun one. Let's get started. For those curious about where these insights come from, you'll find the main sources listed in the description below. This includes links to interviews, technical papers, and official guidelines for further reading if you want to explore this topic more deeply. And by the way, all the video clips I'm going to sprinkle throughout this video are taken from my previous videos about immersive audio production. If anything of that looks interesting to you, do not forget to subscribe to my channel. I'd really appreciate that. And with that out of the way, let's jump into the first tip. Less is more in the Atmos field. When you start out working with Dolby Atmos, it's tempting to go wild. You've suddenly got this massive playground of speakers all around and above your listeners. The natural instinct is to fill every single one of them with sound. But that's actually the biggest rookie mistake. The professionals all emphasize restraint as the key to effective Atmos mixing. Think of it like seasoning a dish. You want just enough to enhance the flavor, not so much that it overwhelms everything else. Start every Atmos mix by asking yourself what elements actually benefit from being placed in the spatial field. Not everything needs to be flying around in the room. What I find fascinating is how often a subtle spatial effect can have more profound impact than going overboard. For example, just slightly widening the reverb of a vocal into the height channels can create this gorgeous sense of space without feeling gimmicky. Remember, your listeners didn't come for a theme park ride, they came for the music. The immersion should support that experience, not distract from it. Anchor the core elements first. Building on our first tip, one of the most consistent pieces of advice I've found is to establish a rock-solid foundation before getting fancy with your spatial effects. When you're working with Atmos, think of it as building a house. You don't start by designing elaborate skylights before laying the foundation. The same principles apply here. Most top Atmos engineers start by placing the primary elements, typically lead vocals, bass, kick drum, and snare, in what they call the anchor positions. These core elements are often kept toward the front of the mix, similar to where they would be in stereo, to maintain that immediate connection with the listener. What I find particularly clever about this approach is how it creates a hierarchy in your mix. Once your foundation is solid, you can then introduce secondary elements around the listener, maybe backing vocals spread wider, guitar textures in the surrounds, or ambient synths in the height channels. This method ensures your mix remains focused while still taking full advantage of the immersive possibilities. It's all about creating a structure where the supporting elements can actually support rather than competing with your core tracks. Utilize the full 3D soundstage. Now that we have established the importance of restraint and anchoring, let's talk about what makes Atmos genuinely special, that full three-dimensional canvas you get to paint on. The biggest mindset shift when moving from stereo to Atmos is breaking free from just thinking left to right. You now have front to back and up-down dimensions to play with, and the magic happens when you thoughtfully use all three dimensions. What this means practically, for example, is that instead of simulating a string section being further back in the mix by adding reverb and cutting high frequencies, you can literally place these strings behind the listener. And instead of using fancy phase tricks to make something feel higher, you can actually position it in the height channels. One particularly effective technique is to map the physical arrangement of the musicians in the studio to their placement in your Atmos mix. Imagine the band setup, drums in the back, vocalists in the front, guitar and keys to the sides, and then create that same spatial relationship around your listener. But here's what separates the beginners from the pros. A great Atmos mix doesn't just place sounds in various speakers, it creates a cohesive three-dimensional space where everything has its place. It's not about isolating points of sound, it's about crafting an environment that envelops the listener. Leverage spatial separation for clarity. This next tip might be my favorite because it solves one of the biggest challenges we face in stereo mixing, the constant battle for space. In a traditional stereo mix, you are essentially trying to cram an entire band through two speakers. Every instrument is fighting for its own little slice in the frequency spectrum, which often leads to aggressive EQ moves, heavy compression, and various tricks just to make everything audible. Atmos changes the game completely. With roughly 6 times more speaker output than stereo, you can physically separate elements that would normally mask each other. What is exciting about this possibility is how it lets each instrument breathe. You don't need to compress the life out of everything just to maintain audibility. You can preserve more of the natural dynamics because elements aren't constantly stepping on each other's toes. This spatial separation doesn't just solve technical problems, it creates a more engaging listening experience. Our brains are wired to process spatial information, and when we can clearly locate each element in a three-dimensional space, we can appreciate the subtleties of the performance in a way that simply is not possible in stereo. Be cautious with the center channel. Now let's talk about something that might seem counterintuitive at first. The center channel isn't always your friend in Atmos music mixing. In film sound, that center speaker is primarily dedicated to dialogue, keeping the actors' voices locked to the screen regardless of where you're sitting in the theater, but music is a completely different beast. For example, putting lead vocals only in the center channel might seem logical at first, but it often makes the vocal feel too isolated and narrow compared to how we are used to hearing vocals in stereo. In stereo, lead vocals are typically phantom-centered, meaning that they come equally from both left and right speakers, creating a center image. This gives vocals a certain width and presence that can get lost if you just slam them into a single center speaker. What many professionals do instead is create a blend using some center channel for focus and stability, but also spreading the vocals across the left and right front speakers to maintain that familiar width and fullness. It's a subtle art of balancing focus and spaciousness. At the same time, it's also interesting how this approach can vary by genre. In a sparse acoustic track, for example, a center-heavy vocal might work beautifully, but in a dense rock mix, that same approach could make the singer feel disconnected from the band. Some engineers even take a more radical approach, avoiding the dedicated center entirely for lead vocals and sticking with the phantom center approach from stereo. While I wouldn't recommend this as a blanket rule, it is worth experimenting with how much center channel works for your specific track. The takeaway here is to trust your ears rather than following rigid placement rules. The center channel is a powerful tool, but it requires a thoughtful touch, especially for the most important element in most mixes, the human voice. Keep overhead sounds ambient. When we talk about what makes an Atmos mix truly special, the height dimension is usually the first thing that comes to mind. Those speakers above the listener can create magical experiences, but they can also create jarring, unnatural ones if used incorrectly. Our ears have expectations about what kinds of sounds should come from above, and those expectations are largely shaped by our real-world experiences. Think about it. In nature, what kinds of sounds typically come from above us? That's rain, thunder, birds flying overhead, the reverberant sound of a large space. These tend to be ambient, diffuse sounds rather than direct, dry sources. Our brains aren't used to hearing a dry, closed-mic'd vocal or a direct brass instrument from directly overhead. When we place those types of sounds in the height channels, it can feel disorienting or gimmicky. But what works brilliantly in those overhead speakers are elements like room ambience, reverb tails, atmospheric pads, and spatial effects. This doesn't mean that you can never put melodic elements overhead, but when you do, they typically benefit from some diffusion or ambience. A synthesizer pad that's already washy and atmospheric can work beautifully up there, while a dry, punchy synth might feel a little bit out of place. So while it might be tempting to put all sorts of elements overhead just because you can, remember that the most natural and immersive experiences typically come from reserving that space for the kinds of sounds your ears expect to hear from above. Add motion for immersion, but purposefully. One of the most exciting capabilities of Atmos is the ability to create movement in your mix, to have sounds travel around the listener in ways that were impossible in stereo. But as with everything in Atmos, restraint and purpose are key. Motion for motion's sake becomes a gimmick very quickly. The question should always be, does this movement enhance the emotional impact of the song, or is it just a cool trick? Our brains are evolutionarily wired to pay attention to moving sounds, especially those above us. It's a survival mechanism. Our ancestors needed to notice that rustling in the trees overhead that might be a predator. This means that even subtle movements in an Atmos mix can create a powerful sense of engagement. For example, you can use automation to subtly move backing vocals around the listener during a chorus, creating this sense of being surrounded by harmonies that expand and contract with the emotions of the song. Gradual, organic movements tend to work better than rapid ping-pong effects. Our ears find natural, smooth transitions more pleasing than jarring jumps from speaker to speaker. The takeaway here is to think of motion as a compositional element in your mix, something that develops and evolves with the music rather than a special effect you throw in to impress people. When movement has a purpose, it can create magical listening experiences that simply aren't possible in stereo. Reference on multiple systems, including stereo. This tip is absolutely crucial, yet often overlooked, the importance of checking your Atmos mix across different playback scenarios. The reality of Atmos today is that people will experience your mix on everything from a full 7.1.4 speaker setup to a soundbar to headphones via binaural rendering to simply hearing the stereo fold down. Each of those scenarios presents different challenges and compromises. One particularly important reference is the original stereo master. When you're reimagining an existing stereo track for Atmos, that original mix represents the artist and producer's approved vision of the song. Your immersive version should feel like an enhancement of that vision, not a drastic reinvention. Most professionals constantly A/B between the Atmos mix and the stereo original, asking questions like, does this still have the same emotional impact? Is the balance between elements still appropriate? Am I preserving what made the original mix special while adding new immersive dimensions? I've often argued that it is particularly valuable to check the binaural headphone render of your Atmos mix, since this is how many listeners will experience it through services like Apple Music. The spatial cues that work in a speaker setup sometimes translate differently to headphones, and you might need to make adjustments to ensure the experience is compelling in both scenarios. There's also the matter of the stereo fold down, how your Atmos mix collapses when played on a regular stereo system. Elements that you've placed in surrounds or heights need to fold down in a way that doesn't lose the important musical content or create phase issues. The key takeaway is to think of your Atmos mix not as a single fixed entity, but as a flexible framework that needs to adapt gracefully to different playback environments. The most successful Atmos mixes are the ones that sound impressive on high-end systems, but still translate well to more limited playback scenarios. Preserve punch and dynamics. This next tip is one of the most common complaints about early Atmos music mixes, that they sometimes lost the impact and energy of their stereo versions. Let's not forget, what good is immersion if it doesn't still hit you in the chest? The challenge comes from the physics of how we perceive impact in audio. When all your drums, bass, and other punchy elements are concentrated in a stereo field, there's a certain density and focus to that energy. When you start spreading those elements across a 3D sphere, you can inadvertently dilute that impact. There are several strategies to maintain punch in Atmos. One approach is to be particularly careful with the placement of transient heavy elements like drums, keeping the kick and snare primarily anchored in the front speakers with perhaps just a touch of room sound in the surrounds often preserves more of the direct impact. Another technique involves being strategic with your bass management. Low frequencies are naturally omnidirectional, but that doesn't mean you should spread your bass across all available speakers. Many engineers find that keeping bass elements focused in the front speakers with minimal use of the LFE channel maintains more of that chest-thumping quality we expect from modern music. What I find most interesting about this challenge is that it's a new frontier in mixing technique. In stereo, we've had decades to develop approaches for maintaining punch and impact. In Atmos, we are still discovering the best practices, but the core principles remain. Dynamics and impact should be enhanced, not sacrificed, by the immersive format. Use the LFE channel sparingly. My final tip focuses on that mysterious 0.1 in 5.1.2 or 7.1.4, the LFE or low frequency effects channel. This dedicated subwoofer feed is often misunderstood in music mixing, and using it effectively requires some special considerations. First, let me clarify what the LFE channel is and isn't. It's not simply the bass channel. It's an additional channel specifically designed for low frequency extension and effects. In film mixing, it is used for those room-shaking moments like explosions or Godzilla footsteps. In music, its role is much more nuanced. Think of the LFE as a seasoning and not a main ingredient. Your primary bass content, the bass guitar, kick drum, synth bass, should live in the main channels of your mix. The LFE is there to provide extra extension and impact when needed. A common technique is to filter your LFE content quite strictly, typically allowing only frequencies below 80 to 120 Hz through. This prevents mid-bass muddiness and focuses the subwoofer on what it does best, reproducing those deep, visceral lows that you feel as much as you hear. What I find particularly important about LFE management is a very simple test. Can you mute the LFE channel and still have a full balanced mix with proper bass response? If removing the LFE makes your mix sound thin or weak, you are likely relying on it too heavily. Remember, many listeners won't have a subwoofer at all, so your main channels need to carry the essential bass information. Some engineers create a dedicated LFE signal by filtering a copy of the bass elements and adding specific low-end enhancements just for that channel. Others prefer to use the LFE more selectively, bringing it in only for climactic moments in the song where extra sub-bass impact would enhance the emotional experience. The key principle here is intentionality. The LFE channel is a powerful tool, but it should be used deliberately to enhance your mix rather than as a default destination for all bass content. And there you have it, 10 professional mixing tips for Dolby Atmos, curated from some of the best engineers in the business, with my own thoughts added in. Now I'm really curious, do you agree with these tips or do you disagree with any of them? Maybe you've discovered some techniques of your own that I didn't cover today. The field of immersive audio is constantly evolving, and I'm sure there are plenty of important tips that I might have missed. So please share your own Atmos mixing secrets in the comments below or join our free Discord server for a chat. The invite link is in the description below. And don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on all things Dolby Atmos and immersive audio. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.